This is Euromaidan Press. I'm Serhiy. Today we're going to discuss the Russian threat to NATO, Ukraine, and European security with Edward Hunter Christie, a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of the International Affairs and a former NATO official. Hello, Edward.
Hello, Serhiy. Thanks for having me.
Recently, voices have been growing louder that Russia may attack NATO countries. Politicians and military experts talk about different timelines, but most of them seem to agree on one thing. A Russian attack on the alliance cannot be ruled out in the coming years. What conditions must be in place for such an attack on NATO to be possible, in your opinion?
There's more than one scenario, and I think it's very important that everyone is aware of the current threat, which is related to developments in Ukraine. Because, of course, if Russia has more success in Ukraine, this will make a further attack on other European countries also more likely. And that is why governments across Europe, and especially the eastern flank countries that are close to Ukraine or neighbors of Ukraine or up in the Baltics, they are the ones who support Ukraine the strongest since the very beginning, because they understand this kind of overflow effect. If the Russians become more confident because they have more success in Ukraine, then they may take even bolder risks and attack further countries. And so there's different scenarios. For example, if Ukraine were forced to make a compromise deal, a dirty peace with Russia, kind of Minsk III, then of course the Russian forces which have been used against Ukraine, a large part of them would be freed up as resources that Russia could turn to threaten other European countries. So that would be one threat scenario from the perspective of the other European countries. Then there is an extremely negative scenario, which we all pray will never happen, which is that Russia actually defeats Ukraine over time, and then after that then rolls forward even more, exploiting also the resources of Ukraine. So that's, let's say, the very, very most negative scenario, the nightmare scenario. But the in-between scenario would be a dirty peace, which is imposed on Ukraine, where Ukraine would run out of ammunition as it is today. But imagine that scenario being worse and worse and worse over time. And then there would be a crisis in Ukraine, and Ukraine would be forced to make some kind of compromise. And then Russia could turn its forces to intimidate others.
Okay, and Anders Nielsen, a military analyst at the Royal Danish Defense College, believes that if Russia attacks NATO countries, it would not attack the Baltic states on its western border, but would focus on a more distant area where fewer countries would be involved. Anders Nielsen believes that a more likely place for a Russian attack on NATO may be northern Finland. In your opinion, what are the possible scenarios in case Russia invades one of the NATO countries?
I think the merit of that particular scenario is that it's unusual and sort of it provokes reflection, which is a good thing. I don't know if an attack on northern Finland only is an especially likely scenario. I think we have to be ready for all scenarios. And also we have to understand that the fundamental strength of an alliance is to always treat any armed attack on any part of any of our territories of any ally as an attack on all of us. And so it should not matter whether it's northern Finland, whether it's some eastern region of Estonia, or whether it's right through the center into Poland, or it's missile strikes into the middle of Europe. It doesn't matter. An armed attack is an armed attack, and there should be a full response. That's very, very important to stick to that principle. Our political leaders, unfortunately, perhaps are sometimes too timid to speak clearly the way I have now. They sometimes do, but it's not frequent enough. So I think that principle must be absolutely rock solid. But I do agree with the fact that Russia would tend rationally to try to look for vulnerabilities, to try to look for ways to fracture the alliance, or to do something where it would hope that some members of the alliance would start to say, oh, well, maybe it's not so bad, maybe we can negotiate, or it's only a small piece of a small ally far away, and then we avoid certain risks of a much worse war. But crossing the NATO line, that has to be a triple red line. That's very important.
You have called on Western leaders to move from the escalation management approach to one that removes the Russian threat, Let me quote you. Western military assistance to Ukraine since February 2022 has gone through several phases of hesitancy and delay ahead of the possible delivery of more potent weapon systems. These phases of hesitancy have been motivated most decisively by fears of escalation, notably fears of a wider war against Russia. Their effect has been painfully obvious. Ukraine has had to fight a war for its national survival without a full range of relevant capabilities. As a result, Ukraine is undersupplied in weapons and unable to prevail, which prolongs the war without sufficiently weakening the aggressor. End of quote. In your opinion, how can the West redefine its policy towards Russia?
I think fundamentally the realization has to be that at the end of the day, there is only one state threat against Europe, and it is the same threat that is now attacking Ukraine. In other words, it's the Russian Federation under its current leadership. That's the only threat we need to deal with. And therefore, from the perspective of how European countries manage their military inventories, their stocks of weapons, and so on, at the end of the day, the purpose of those weapons would be to either fight against Russia in case we have to, or to deter Russia from attacking us. But given that Ukraine is already in the fight, it is rational to transfer a bigger share than what we're currently doing of our weapons to Ukraine so that Ukraine can degrade, damage, reduce the Russian threats against the rest of us. And so effectively, I think the insight is to consider that the security of the European countries that are now in the EU and NATO and the security of Ukraine, that is one and indivisible, because we only have one enemy. And therefore, everything that flows to Ukraine to help defeat the Russian aggression, that is a security benefit to the countries further west. But there's an alternative. The alternative to that, which is partly what is happening, is to be in fear of a possible future Russian attack, which is deemed uncertain, and therefore then countries try to hold on to certain key weapon systems because they're afraid of this escalation. But my argument is that's an irrational way of looking at it. It is suboptimal, because the optimal way is to push back on the Russian threat, which is already exploding into Ukraine now since 2 years. And so the best solution for a future secure European continent is to defeat the Russian Federation in Ukraine now and not wait, because the more this drags on, the more Russia has time to build up its combat experience, its weapon stocks, its ammunition stocks. And in the end, this puts us into a very uncomfortable race, which in the end is even more dangerous and may lead to an even wider and more destructive war.
Okay, US military aid to Ukraine is crumbling, while Russia is ramping up arms production and has already put its economy on a war footing. Will Ukraine be able to stay afloat without US military aid if Donald Trump returns to the White House and US support for Ukraine comes to a complete halt? Will European support be enough to help Ukraine repel the Russian invasion, in your opinion?
This is a very difficult question. I certainly hope that the Europeans will do everything they can to ensure that Ukraine can stay in the fight and continue to push back the Russian invasion. But we have to be honest, the US assistance is large and systemically important to Ukraine's war effort. And so removing that entire pillar is truly very, very problematic and difficult to replace. Effectively, at least for this calendar year, it probably cannot be completely replaced, only partially compensated. And then we're back to the problem I mentioned before, which is the risk of a negative cascade of political decisions, whereby certain European countries would think, okay, well, now that the situation is even more dangerous, we had better keep bigger military inventories and put a priority on rearming ourselves in our national inventories, and as a secondary priority, those for the NATO defense, but not for Ukraine's defense. But that is all a mistake. In reality, we have to go in a straight line, like I mentioned before. But having said all that, the political battle continues. The Polish government, for example, Foreign Minister Sikorski, among others, are still trying to push very hard to convince the Americans to finally pass the relevant legislation in Congress so that the aid to Ukraine can resume. And so there is considerable political pressure going on behind the scenes, and hopefully we will prevail on that. We all need that. At the same time, it is already the time, and Foreign Minister Sikorski said so, it's already the time to warn our American friends very openly and very clearly that if the aid doesn't come through, this will have not only catastrophic consequences for Ukraine, but it will also lead to major damage to all of America's alliances everywhere in the world, because other governments will see that you could be a close, loyal partner of the United States, and they supply you for a while, and all of a sudden they can pull the plug. So this is incredibly worrying for all countries that are allies of the United States, including countries like Poland or Asian allies. So it's extremely important to explain to the Americans how destructive the current paralysis could become if it is not resolved quickly.
Okay, can we talk a bit more about the strategic implications of a Russian victory in the war against Ukraine for the security of Europe and the United States? What would be the consequences for the United States if it stopped aid to Ukraine completely?
Well, then it depends on the trajectory of the war, which we cannot be completely certain about. I mean, it's logical to assume the Ukrainian armed forces would have an extraordinarily difficult job if the US assistance never comes back. But so it would depend on the outcome of the war. If Ukraine were completely subjugated, which would be a terrible thing for the population of Ukraine, of course, I think we can predict several different catastrophic events. One is a very large refugee flow of Ukrainians into Europe, probably in the millions of people. Huge human suffering, of course. Many Ukrainian prisoners of war would probably be tortured, executed, etc. And then the other piece of the puzzle, which is very frightening for all of us, is that I have no doubt that the Putin regime would force as many Ukrainians as possible to to become Russian, if you like. They would be forcibly converted, if you like, and be forcibly even recruited into the Russian armed forces. I'm sure that many Ukrainians would so much hate this that they would refuse, they would flee, they would commit suicide, they would do all sorts of things. But I think some would probably obey in order to survive better under the new occupation regime. And this would simply mean that Russia has won a war, has a large army of people with combat experience, and on top of that has hoovered up hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian recruits with varying degrees of loyalty to Moscow, but additional men. And we know how Russia fights. They use blocking troops, they force people forward, they've used prisoners, they've used poor people from Buryatia and strange places like that. No offense to the Buryats, but they would do the same for people from southern and eastern Ukraine. And so then this machine would come forward and create even more misery and even more threat for the rest of Europe. This would be massively costly, a humanitarian disaster, and the threat of more war.
Okay, according to the Financial Times, Germany, Italy, and France oppose the confiscation of frozen Russian assets, while the US, UK, Japan, and Canada support it. What arguments can be used to convince opponents of transferring frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine?
I think the arguments are incredibly clear. First of all, there is legal precedent for confiscating state assets. It's already happened. It happened against Iraq after Iraq had attacked Kuwait in the early 1990s. So this was something that was done, and it was approved through the United Nations. And so there is a legal precedent, first of all, to do exactly that kind of measure. So legally, it's doable. The second issue, it's a broader reasoning. It's a bit more political as a reasoning, but it is the simple fact that wars of aggression that are also wars of conquest, where the enemy actually annexes territory, as Russia is doing against Ukraine now, those are quite rare. We have not had that in Europe since the Second World War, and even in the rest of the world. They're not especially common, but they are the very worst violation of international law, of the UN Charter of the Sovereignty of States that exists. That there's nothing worse than doing that. And therefore, there is a clear incentive for, I think, the majority of states in the international system to send a very clear signal that if you do that, you will be severely punished in a wide variety of ways, militarily, also economically. And hence, I think, I mean, if you do not take that measure of confiscating sovereign assets in that situation, in a situation of a war of aggression and conquest, then when are you going to do it? It means you're never going to do it, and that cannot possibly make sense. And there is, thirdly, both legal and political argument. Russia is responsible for all of the damage caused to Ukraine. It was Russia's choice to start this war, and all of the destruction that has happened to Ukraine, cities, infrastructure, lives lost, etc. That is all the responsibility of Russia, and Russia must pay. So as a natural justice principle, there's also the argument of saying crime should not pay, and the criminal should be made to pay to compensate the victim. That's a principle of natural justice which exists in international law and in domestic law. So the arguments are incredibly strong. In fact, there aren't really any valid arguments against doing this seizure or confiscation of the assets. They are, in any case, practically already frozen. And it is already the position of G7 governments that the assets will not be returned to Russia unless it voluntarily pays for reparations. But they probably won't. And so therefore, it's just time to force the mechanism and just take the money.
Okay, thank you for this interesting conversation, Edward. It was exciting to hear your opinion about such important issues. Thank you everyone for being with us today. Please follow Euromaidan Press on social media, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow Edward Hunter Christie's social media accounts. The details are in the comments section below this interview. Bye.
Thanks very much, Sari. Bye-bye.